We want today to take up Kant's Ethics. And let me start by reminding you that at the end of the critique of practical reason, at the end of his first critique, he points out that even though in terms of what he calls doctrinal belief, what we can know metaphysically, rationally, we cannot demonstrate the existence of God. Yet it may be possible on the basis of ethics to affirm rationally the existence of God. So there's a natural transition between the first critique on pure reason and the second critique on practical reason. It's sometimes said that the first critique is dealing with our faculty of knowing, the second critique with our faculty of willing, and the third critique, critique of judgment, with the faculty of feeling. All right, maybe, but in any case it's in the second critique that you get the notion of the moral will introduced, and moral responsibility, moral duty, and so forth. Now, a few preliminaries. One is this comment that by anybody's reading, Kant is a moral realist. That is to say, he insists that there are objective moral truths about objective moral qualities, that there are objectively real moral distinctives between right and wrong, between virtue and vice. He's a moral realist, in that sense an objectivist. And his famous categorical imperative, which we'll be looking at, tells us how we can know that difference between right and wrong. Now, his moral realism is, however, very much in keeping with the concerns of others in the late 18th century. There's a sense in which the 18th century could be described as an age of moral crisis, because the aftermath of the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution in physics, was of course a turn to a mechanistic science without teleology, therefore without the conception of the good as an all-inclusive ideal which everything in nature strives to imitate. The result was that right after the scientific revolution and during it, there was a groping for some new way of addressing ethical questions. And we saw in Bacon, and it's true in Descartes as well, a kind of early version of utilitarianism. It's in terms of what works. There was a sophisticated development in Thomas Hobbes, whom the 18th century saw as an unqualified hedonist, a thoroughgoing determinist, without recognizing a shred of human goodwill, benevolence. That was the 18th century reading of Hobbes. And when we were talking about him, I think I pointed out that it doesn't really come out that way. There are notes of benevolence in his concern and so forth. The 18th century also called him a thoroughgoing atheist. And that's not the case clearly at all. But in any case, that reading of Hobbes precipitated a great deal of concern among 18th century philosophers for providing some objective grounding of morals, a concern about moral realism, you see. One of the moves in that direction was the Cambridge Platonism, you remember. Another, you might say, is John Locke's attempt to ground natural law, human law, in the rational nature of human beings. Some reading I was doing just this morning, I discovered that Locke was very close to the daughter of Ralph Cudworth, who was really the leading Cambridge Platonist, you see. And Locke's rejection of innate ideas may well have been a rejection, as we mentioned before, of the Cambridge Platonism. But at the same time, he shared their concern for an objective grounding of ethics. The same was the concern of those moral sense philosophers, people like Butler, Adam Smith, Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, that we noted more in passing than anything else. And that Shaftesbury was the son of a family where Locke was hired as a tutor, so he was the tutor to the Shaftesbury who later developed moral sense philosophy. That Shaftesbury rejected Locke's approach to ethics and wanted to have something much more definite, and so the development of that notion of a moral sense. David Hume, it's said, was very much influenced by the moral sense thinkers. In fact, there is an interpretation, a fairly recent interpretation that's been developed in the last 10 years or so, that David Hume was so much influenced by the moral sense philosophers that he too shared their concern about ethical realism. Now, when we were talking about him, I suggested that he was an ethical subjectivist. That is to say something is right or wrong is simply to refer to how people feel about it. But according to this newer interpretation, those moral feelings, moral sentiments, are simply signs by which we recognize what is objectively the way it is. The case for that interpretation of Hume really hinges on some statements that Hume seems to make about the difference between virtue and vice, which sound as if he's talking about objective qualities of individuals, of human beings. So that if virtue and vice are objective qualities, then there is an objective difference between those qualities, and you've got moral objectivity, at least in the status of the moral qualities. So this matter of moral realism was very much a concern of 18th century thinkers. Likewise of Immanuel Kant, very much a moral realist. Trying to avoid some of the possible ethical implications of that mechanistic science with its causal determinism, which of course would take away from individual moral responsibility, and its implicit subjectivist implications. So it's with that in mind, then, that Kant writes about ethics. Now, his approach to ethics is remarkably like his approach to metaphysics. There, in examining the faculty of knowing, what he looks for is the a priori structures, the subjective structures that shape the way in which we think and understand as well as perceive things. In the Critique of Practical Reason, he's again looking for the mental structures, the subjective structures or principles that we bring to our moral thinking. And again, the question is whether those structures of our thought are purely subjective, as was the case with the forms and categories, or whether they have any objective correlates. So that when it turns out that the subjective structure involves some sense of duty, of respect for moral law, the question is whether there is any objective moral law, you see. And while he concludes that the forms and categories used in science and metaphysics are purely subjective, it turns out that the categories used in ethics are objective. That is to say, there are objective correlates. There is such a thing as objective moral duty, as an objective difference between right and wrong, objective moral law. So he is, in those regards, a moral realist. Now, in order to see the way he does that, you have to recognize then that he is again seeing the synthetic a priori nature of ethical judgments. So that the ethical judgment, then, involves the confluence of two kinds of input. On the one hand, empirical input, and on the other hand, some a priori principle. So that when we say stealing is wrong, you get an empirical description of an act that is known as stealing, and you get the concept of wrong or lack of rightness as the a priori principle. So that what you get then is the introduction of an a priori principle in our moral reflection, in our moral awareness, an a priori principle that is applied to factual situations, applied to, not implied in, but applied to factual situations. This a priori principle is, of course, the categorical imperative. Now, you have an initial selection about this in the anthology, the last little piece of Kant in the anthology, the last piece in the anthology, period. And that is taken not from the Critique of Practical Reason, but from his Metaphysical Foundations of Morals. Some of you may have read that material in your introductory course, and recall that what he does is to start by saying that there is only one thing that is unconditional.